Hey everybody, this is John with nVisium here. We're going to go ahead and get started with some introductions. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking a little bit about AWS reInvent. We're going to be providing a recap of the event. And again, this is Jonn Poulin with nVisium. We also have Gamblin from Kenna Security joining us today. And we also have one of my colleagues, Callahan. Jerry, would you like to go ahead and just provide a quick introduction of yourself and Kenna?
Yeah, my name is Gamblin. I'm the principal security engineer at Kenna Security. We do vulnerability management prioritizations for companies. So everybody has more vulnerabilities on their network than they can normally handle, and we help you prioritize what you should be working on today and what can wait until tomorrow.
Thanks, Jerry. And John, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. So my name is Jonn Callahan. I'm one of the principal security consultants at nVisium, a small little boutique consulting firm. I'm also our AWS security lead and currently SA Pro certified solutions architect with AWS.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. So my name's Jonn Poulin, Director of Engineering at nVisium. I go by Force Request on the Twitter. So I'm currently Amazon Solutions Architect Associate and Specialty Security Certified. I also act as an AWS Subject Matter Expert, which is one of their newer programs they've been offering. And nVisium is a software and cloud security firm. We focus mainly on integrating security through your SDLC, providing services such as security assessments, software assurance, and security development training. And we're going to have some contact info at the end of the slide if anyone's looking to get in touch with us or Jerry from Kenna in regards to what services we provide. All of that information can be found at the end. So we were at reInvent last week. If you've never been to reInvent, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite conferences. In the security industry, I personally tend to attend a lot more attacker-focused conferences such as DEF CON, Black Hat, some of the B-Sides conferences, and it's quite refreshing to get out to a more diverse conference. You know, there are a lot of developers, there are a lot of network engineers, infrastructure admin, etc. To be found at reInvent. And, you know, it's a long time to be in Vegas. The conference spans over a week, but we go pretty much every year to learn about the new, latest and greatest tools and techniques out there, and to, you know, do some meet and greet with some of the AWS employees themselves. So again, myself, Jonn Callahan, and Jerry Gamblin were out there this past week, and we're here today to provide, you know, an overview of what we found most interesting, and to have a discussion on some of the new services that are going to be coming out or have already came out. So, you know, one of the things I found most interesting, and this is probably my personal favorite tool that they released, is called Security Hub. And Security Hub is generally available right now. So if you're an AWS customer, you can go ahead and enable it directly within the AWS console. And what Security Hub does is it integrates with several AWS services and third-party tools such as Amazon GuardDuty, Amazon Inspector, and Amazon Macie. And it provides essentially a centralized dashboard for security-related information. So as an example, Amazon Macie uses machine learning to classify data that's stored specifically in S3 buckets. And that'll make you aware of locations where you may be storing certain data such as social security numbers, credit card numbers, etc. And the Security Hub will display that in a centralized dashboard. And this is essentially an executive level dashboard, something you could give one of your executives and say, okay, this is overall where our security posture, you know, is from the AWS perspective. And again, with Macie, Macie is driven by machine learning. And machine learning was one of the largest buzzwords we heard at the conference this year. And we'll be diving into that a little bit more. Jerry or John, have you guys had a chance to play with Security Hub at all yet?
I've had a chance to look at it, and outside of the corporate or board level dashboard you're talking about, which is nice, it's starting to look like it's going to have a very nice centralized API on the back end. So you'll be able to make one call and get information and findings from all of these services instead of a myriad of calls. I think I counted, and they have 32 unique sources that they'll pull from into Security Hub. So it can really streamline your automation process.
They're still locked down to regions, though, right? Like you're doing centralized calls, but just across like US East 1, US East 2, all that.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
So leave it to you to point out one of the negatives in the first couple seconds of the webinar here, John.
That's why I'm here, right?
Yeah, no, so you're exactly right. So unfortunately, this is not a global service. It has to be enabled on a per region basis. In my opinion, that was a bad decision by AWS. I wish this was another service that's global. That way it's a one click to enable it. Unless you toggle throughout regions. One of the big issues we see is that folks only implement security tooling in the regions they are generally operating in, such as US East. But in the event of an AWS account compromise, you're going to be you need to look across all the other regions for assets being deployed to regions you don't currently operate in or don't currently have security tooling in. So by default, this doesn't give you 100% visibility. So I definitely agree.
I almost understand the reasoning, but it's single region, but cross account. So you can add other accounts to your Security Hub and see them, but only for the region that those accounts are in.
I see. So honestly, one of the things I'm most excited about in regards to Security Hub is the automatic CIS benchmarking. So a lot of organizations we work with use the CIS benchmarking to determine what level of risk they have in regard to their cloud infrastructure. So if you're an AWS customer, you may be familiar with Prowler. Prowler is an automated tool that'll run certain checks on AWS and tell you which checks you failed. And Amazon has essentially brought that service into Security Hub, and it's available by default in the, once you've enabled it in the region. So this is great. One of the first recommendations we always give our customers is, hey, run the CIS benchmark, and start to fix those particular findings, because it's going to come back with some pretty trivial stuff such as, password policies, CloudTrail not enabled, etc. And so this is going to be a great way for folks who aren't fully vested in AWS security to very easily, start to lock down their accounts. So I'm super excited about this one per se. So one of the other concerns, I have with Security Hub is their pricing model. And I don't know if anyone else has looked into this extensively, but AWS says the pricing is under development. And right now it's free for the preview time. This scares me a little bit. I don't know. How do you guys feel about this particular model?
I mean, if you're an enterprise customer, that's dangerous. If you're someone who has an extremely large environment, you may come back with a huge bill you weren't anticipating. So, I mean, they'll have to iron this out. There's no way they're going to keep the pricing vague when it actually comes out for GA. But we'll see. I mean, historically, AWS has released services, and they're a little bit overpriced, depending on what they are. So I'm hoping Security Hub isn't one of them. It actually comes at a reasonable cost, but we'll see.
I'm definitely in the look but not committed stage, right? Because you don't know what it's going to cost. So I'm not spending a bunch of cycles and building it into anything that can't be easily pulled out of the workflow until you understand what it costs. Because not only are you paying for Security Hub, you also have to pay for the back-end services too. So you're paying for Inspector, and then you're paying for basically an abstraction layer that is Security Hub. Because I think outside of the CIS checks, it doesn't have any independent functions.
Yeah, it's just a nice little neat wrapper around everything that's already there.
Yeah, I think you're right. And if you guys remember, when AWS released, I want to say it was Macie, folks started enabling it, not really understanding the pricing model. And then we're getting some bills that were very steep, upwards of 10% to 100% of their monthly bill, right? It was just one of those services where if you don't understand it, you're going to price yourself out of business. So let's hope Security Hub, doesn't turn out in that direction. I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to be pretty cheap since it relies on other AWS services. I hope they give it away for free personally. I mean, you're already going to be paying for config. You're going to be paying for Macie. This should be a free service.
It would be a good leg up, not leg up, but a good match against Azure too, since they already have I think it's just called Security Center. And that's, it might be free. I can't remember exactly if it's free or not, but it does essentially what Security Hub does. It goes through and does all the like baseline sane benchmarking stuff to make sure you don't have anything dumb like internet accessible security groups and things like that.
One thing I don't know about is if this automatically integrates the Trusted Advisor security metrics or not. And if it does, I wonder if it's going to replace Trusted Advisor for those specific things, you know, because Trusted Advisor will perform some very basic security checks for you by default on just a generic AWS account level. And this will increase based on, you know, whether you're a business or an enterprise customer support. So I'll be curious to see how those integrate. Did you guys have anything else you wanted to talk about in regards to Security Hub?
Actually, yeah, I had a question for Jerry since he's actually spent some time with it. Are they doing any kind of like IAM permission parsing? It's been something I was talking about with some folk earlier today on how to handle that. I'll probably wrap back around this later to a service called Zelkova that's in preview right now. But I was curious if Security Hub is doing any kind of parsing for things like overly privileged roles of some sort. It's hard to do that contextually, but even like someone with admin access is an easy start, or read access to all buckets.
I have not seen that outside of the basic is your root account disabled checks that are part of CIS.
Okay.
So I can add on to that a little bit, John. I've worked with CIS a fair bit, and there are overly permissive checks built into it. In AWS, what this would look like is providing, I want to say it's providing someone with a policy that gives them any level of access to any function or any service. So basically star:***. Yeah. So that I do recall seeing that being implemented. And that's kind of the baseline overly, you know, permissive check. And that's one of the few things you can do without having the context as to how the business should be operating.
Yeah. There's a good amount. I'd be curious as to how deep it goes into that.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see if they'll extend it past the CIS benchmarks. I mean, you know, obviously there's a lot more we can do and automate on an AWS account other than the CIS benchmark. So I'll be curious, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's what they start adding in order to make this a pay-for service. You know, kind of like your business and enterprise support level. You have like your free tier of Security Hub, your business tier, etc.
Yeah, very possibly.
So one thing worth mentioning is there is a talk released. All of the reInvent talks are posted on YouTube. There's some playlists. Just search reInvent 2018. One of the talks worth mentioning here is Sec 397. And this is where they introduce AWS Security Hub and talk about it in a little more detail than we're talking about it today. And we're, you know, one thing to mention is we are going to make these slides available after the fact. So you don't have to worry about taking notes. You can just grab a copy of the slide and see, you know, which course number I was talking about here. So anything you guys want to add before we move on?
I'm good.
So
I'm good also. Yep.
Perfect. I had already moved on. So this Amazon S3 is probably one of my favorite things to talk about. I know Jerry and John both love talking about S3 security as well. If you're not familiar with Amazon S3, it's actually their second oldest service. It came out circa 2006. I want to, the only service that was released prior to this was SQS. So S3 is very old. And as we know, old software tends to have more problems with it. One of the largest problems with Amazon S3 is the fact that it has a rich history of access control failures. So a lot of organizations come into S3, they decide they want to store their data there. Hey, let's put our data in the cloud, make it accessible. You know, people can easily download it. It's cheaper than hosting our own on-prem NAS or servers. So let's just put it in the cloud. And historically, there have been tons of organizations that have been breached because they've put sensitive data into an Amazon S3 bucket. And when I talk about access control failures, I'm generally talking about publicly readable or listable S3 buckets. meaning you can go open your browser, navigate to an organization's S3 bucket and just list all of their contents that are available there. Jerry, I know you've done a little research into some of the public S3 buckets. Is that something you want to talk about a little bit, or?
Yeah, it was a huge problem. There's actually a really good burp plugin that you can use that will, as you run, that'll tell you, hey, if this has an open bucket, because that's how most open buckets are discovered. Somebody's hosting web content out of an S3 bucket. And then at AWS, I was playing around and I registered serverlesssecurity.org as a joke. And I was like, oh, I'm just going to throw this in an S3 bucket. And it was after what we're talking about in the next couple of slides. They've increased their base ACL. And it's flipped 100% the other way from it was super easy to accidentally make stuff public to you have to go and disable a couple of policies to be able to host web content in an S3 bucket now. So
yeah.
It feels like a super, it feels like they went too far.
I'm with you on that. It definitely feels like they've child-proofed it to a large degree. I'm all for being secure by default, but I mean, you should only put so much effort into protecting people from their own dumb decisions before it's like you're wasting cycles on this. If people are going to shoot themselves in the foot, they're going to find a way to shoot themselves in the foot. I'd rather you spend time on doing more interesting things.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and look at some of the changes that are coming to S3. So one of the things we were just talking about is, across the board public access, that we used to see where orgs would have data stored publicly in S3. AWS has released a tool to help kind of mitigate some of this stuff. And we'll dive into that here in a couple seconds. One of the other features they released at reInvent is AWS transfer for SFTP. And this one really struck me when I heard it announced in the keynote. One of the other, features of S3 is an intelligent tiering added to their lifecycle policy mechanism. And they also recently released a mechanism called S3 Object Lock. So we're going to talk about each of these, pretty briefly here. And again, in this webinar, we're completely receptive to questions. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to dump them right in the go-to, webinar chat, and we'll address them as we can, or feel free to reach out to us at the end. So S3 public access. This is what Jerry and John were just talking about a few minutes ago. So back in the day, it used to be very easy to add a file to S3 that was considered public. Anyone on the internet could come back, download it. This happened very, very often in an inadvertent manner. Information was being disclosed publicly. Organizations didn't know about it. To this day, a large percentage of the AWS assessments we perform have some sort of sensitive data that's being leaked over an overly permissive S3, bucket setting. And so Amazon, kind of took all of this feedback they've heard from security consultants like ourselves and built in a better control mechanism to S3. So S3, now has several methods of access control. The legacy method, which occurs, through the console or the API, but they've also added bucket policies. And AWS encourages everyone to use bucket policies if you need a fine-grained control over your access. So what they released this time was this tool called S3 Public Access. So if you were to browse to one of your S3 buckets, you'll see a new option to check your public access settings, kind of like the screenshot you see here. Jerry or John, have you guys played around with this at all yet?
Just trying to disable it. I haven't had much time to look at it outside of that.
Yeah, same boat for me.
Yeah, same here. I mean, so this is one of those things where we trust that they've implemented this stuff well, but we haven't actually verified it yet. And as you know, it's security, trust but verify. So, after this call, one of us is going to have to go check and make sure when you click this button, it's actually going to restrict the public access. So the goal here was for Amazon.
Oh, I know that. Sorry, John. I know that for sure. Like if you create a new bucket today, it's going to have this policy on there, and it's going to restrict public access 100%.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So how do folks go about creating a file that would be public? Let's say I wanted to upload these slides to S3 after and make them public. So I create a new bucket, I upload them there. How would I go about doing that?
You have to go disable this public access policy from the whole bucket, and then you can upload your files and click the button in the wizard, in the GUI wizard that says make this a public file.
That's good. So it's a couple steps, you know, it's not something someone's going to do accidentally, right?
Yeah, it would be, you can't disable this accidentally for sure.
You know how it works at the API level by chance? Is it just an extra API call you have to make? Just disable public access or enable public access, whatever.
I haven't had a chance to look at that. That's a good question. I'm gonna write that down.
Yeah, I'm curious of that as well. I mean, most of the time I operate with S3, it's via the API. So I would be curious how that would work as well. But yeah, I mean, in my opinion, this is a good service because it prevents inadvertent failures. You know, we'll see how people start to use it. You know, I'm very curious. I'm really hoping this will, you know, start to take effect in some of our clients, so their data will be more protected by default. So other than public access, one of the things Amazon, and this was probably the first thing I heard at reInvent that kind of struck me. Amazon S3 SFTP, you know, it's an interesting concept, right? Because when we do network assessments or when we work with our clients, a large number of those clients are still hosting on-premise FTP servers for some reason. And, you know, as the push to cloud, you know, kind of takes over, we're starting to see clients who want to shift to the cloud, but don't have a way of migrating some of their current processes. You know, a lot of orgs have processes that do rely on FTP and SFTP to move bulk data around for batch processing and things like that. And it's easier to give them a foothold into the cloud ecosystem by providing them a managed service to kind of do this for you. So S3 is actually an S3 backed SFTP server. So it's not directly an integration to S3. And I was misled originally about that. So the way this works is you actually have to spin up an SFTP server by the click of a button. And once you've spun that up, you're billed per the hour and you're billed for data transfer. And then it integrates with an Amazon S3 bucket of your choice. So this is more of a standalone service than just an S3 add-on, like I was originally led to believe. But I'm looking forward to seeing clients start to migrate to this. You know, I don't know about you guys, but I get sick of seeing, you know, FTP servers popping up on all of our network pen tests.
So, you know, have you had a chance to look at this? Is because when I saw this, I just kind of glossed over it, and I just assumed this was SFTP as in simple file transfer protocol, like how you update your network gear, your routers. But are they meaning secure file transfer?
Yeah, I was understanding secure file transfer, but that's definitely worth looking into. I haven't played with it myself. They provide fine-grained access control policies and things like that, so you can provision users with IAM just like you would for other services. So if they are not, we'll have to look into it, because if this is not over SSH, which I think it is, then there's going to be a big problem here. So I'm definitely going to look into that one. John, have you seen anything about that?
No, I'm actually with Jerry on that, and that I thought it looked pretty cool, but I more or less glanced over it. I was knee deep in a lot of other things I thought were interesting, and mark this as something to come back to. I am curious as to how they plan to integrate IAM into the SFTP protocol. I'm not intimately familiar with how the protocol works. But we'll be kind of curious as to how they plan on shimming that in.
Yeah, I'm curious too. And, you know, this is available today, so we could all go play with it now. You know, part of the problem with reInvent is we all come back and we have a very extensive list of projects we want to play with, things we want to build, you know, features we want to test. And, you know, there's only so many hours in the day. And unfortunately, my list, you know, I don't know about you guys, but my list is not, you know, well, let's put it this way, it just keeps growing every day. It's kind of like an exponential thing. So we'll have to have someone play with this one. Yeah.
Yep, the proverbial whiteboard that continuously grows.
So S3 intelligent tiering, this is an interesting service. It's not necessarily directly related to security, but it's more of an operational and a cost benefit. So if you're not familiar with S3, S3 has different storage classes or tiers of data storage. Generally, most people use standard, which is for frequently accessed data. If you're trying to store like an archive that's not going to be accessed very often at all, maybe once a year, you would use S3 Glacier and frequently accessed. Intelligent tiering is kind of what it sounds like. It's intelligent. So if you try to access data that has been sitting on S3 for, let's say, a year, it's going to have been automatically migrated to a cheaper storage option, which in the back end here would be S3 infrequently accessed. Now, that's great, but the problem with infrequently accessed is there's some time involved in retrieving those files that have essentially been marked for archive originally. So when you go to access a file that's been moved to infrequently accessed, intelligent tiering will automatically move it back for you. It's for long-lived data that has changing or unknown access patterns. So it's really a great option for a lot of our customers. I don't know if I will be using this personally, but if you do a lot of data archiving, or if you need to, run frequent or monthly audits on things like CloudTrail logs, application logs, this is going to be a great method for you to store your log files at a reduced cost while making sure they're, accessible. Because if you store files in Glacier, which is their cheapest option, they're not always directly accessible when you need them. Have you guys played around with this one at all yet?
No,
I have
the one thing I've been trying to look into is the pricing, because that's really going to be the make or break for this. It's a really cool service. It's something you could shim together with a Lambda and CloudWatch event pretty easily, unless you have like massive amounts of S3 storage. So one of the things I do want to dig into in the relatively near future is a price breakdown of kind of like a breaking point in terms of where it's cheaper for you to write a 15-line Lambda in a CloudWatch event and do this all yourself over enabling this. The one-click button is nice, but if you're looking at like 100 times the cost of a Lambda, why would I do that? Things might get more interesting when you have just like gobs and gobs of data, and parsing all that through Lambda it doesn't make any sense. But even then, a spot instance that runs for 30 minutes that parses all your logs, all your access logs, might be enough, and that might be way cheaper than enabling this. But that's my biggest concern. But like I said, overall, it's a really cool idea, and it's nice that they're enabling that as a feature. I'm sure many organizations or large enterprises have already built their own homebrewed system to do exactly this, though.
Yeah. And, John's pointing out one of the most interesting things about AWS and other cloud platforms is that at this point, they're so robust with services and features. There's at least 10 different ways of accomplishing the same thing. So it's a matter of your business and your team to decide which option works best for you. Sometimes fully managed services work best. Sometimes you want to actually have, root level access to your Kubernetes cluster. That's entirely up to you and your organization. So apart from intelligent tiering, S3 object locks were released, and this was kind of a silent release. I don't know, John or Jerry, did you guys actually hear about this at all in AWS, or because as far as I'm aware, this was kind of a silent release?
I didn't hear about it at the conference.
Yeah, I heard about it through you. Where did you hear about it?
So one of the biggest problems with these conferences is they have so much stuff to release. A lot of the smaller features kind of slide under the radar. So I found this in an Amazon blog post, actually. So they released an S3 feature called Object Lock, which is essentially the ability to make a file immutable, which is great because one of the biggest fears I have is that we will lose data and not be able to reproduce it. If you lose your data and your backups, what are you going to do? Well, with S3 Object Lock, you can essentially create backups of your data and mark them as immutable, which is a great option for ensuring you're not going to be able to delete them, either maliciously or accidentally. One of the problems with this is it has to be enabled at the bucket level during creation. And I hope this is something they change, because what this means is organizations can't easily retroactively mark a particular bucket as an object lock. They would essentially have to duplicate that bucket, configure their applications to point to the new bucket. So it's a little more hands-on. And I suspect this is something we will see Amazon change for, but we'll have to see.
Hey, JP, real quick. We got a question coming in that missed beforehand. So the question is, for intelligent tiering, does moving data to other storage solutions that may not be configured according to an org security policy? That's actually a really interesting question. Knowing how the rest of AWS behaves from a permission modeling standpoint, I'm assuming you can turn it on. There's nothing that's going to stop you from turning on intelligent tiering. But what will end up happening is it'll either give you a prompt to automatically enable the permissions required to make that transition possible between the different object types, or it'll just turn on, and then if it's unable to, it'll just log a CloudWatch error or log an error in CloudWatch that you can go back and parse. That would be my guess as to how it handles it. Again, I haven't had a chance to actually put hands on keyboard with this yet.
Yeah, so one of the things I kind of take from this question is, the keyword other storage solutions. So with intelligent tiering, my understanding is it just moves the data classification. And all the data will still reside in the same region within which it was provisioned. So as an example, if your S3 bucket was created in US East, it's never going to be moved to, let's say, Asia Pacific, as an example, just by enabling intelligent tiering. So I'm not totally sure if we answered your question. If we didn't, feel free to let us know. We're happy to continue this discussion over email. Oops. So S3 best practices, I always like to provide an overview of best practices, for our clients. Jonn, since you're the AWS lead, would you like to kind of provide an overview of the best practices we recommend?
Yeah, sure. So the first one off the bat, I've gotten a little bit of pushback from a lot of people, honestly. And basically, it's just using the old school ACLs, which I pretty much consider legacy at this point.
AWS considers them legacy as well.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, okay. They are officially legacy, and they're only used to provide object level access control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I wonder when that flipped. It wasn't that way for a while. But regardless, using ACLs isn't necessarily a flaw, but they can lead to some pretty dangerous. I mean, the entire permission model can lead to some pretty dangerous things, obviously. But ACLs just make it a lot easier to shoot yourself in the foot. One in particular, and I'm going to forget what it's called, but it's the one that there's an ACL permission which allows authorized AWS users to access to either read and or write to your bucket. And a lot of people flip that one on, thinking that means AWS users that are authorized for their account, which it's not. It's any AWS authorized user for any account at all can have access to your bucket. And I flagged a good amount of clients for this. And it's gotten to the point where I've seen it enough that I actually wrote a bucket scraping tool called BucketCat that'll actually go out and will brute force objects from an S3 bucket. For the rare occasions you come across the ability to actually pull data out of a bucket, but can't list. So it's just stay away from them. There's really no good reason to be using them now that we have full-fledged IAM integration with S3. So I always recommend, as a best practice thing, just to disable them. And as for bucket policies, I mean, this is pretty much self-explanatory. Review your bucket policies. Make sure that you have you're not giving carte blanche read access to all your buckets. I don't care what kind of environment you have. There's never a time in which a single account needs read access to every single bucket. At the very least, you shouldn't have access to backups and CloudTrail logs. Well, only a very few select number of accounts should have access to those, and you're probably not going to have an account that should have access to both. And I mean, it goes doubly true for write access to buckets. And as a general review, I always suggest that people lock down their accounts at a base level and prohibit things like spinning up weird EC2 instances like the GPU ones, the G3 and the G2. And with that comes denying access to buckets that have backups and logging inside of them. Object and server and object level logging, obviously that just goes hand in hand with the best practices when it comes to owning an environment of any kind, making sure you have good visibility into it and understanding everything that's going on with your environment. Encryption and versioning too. I mean, these are all just like standard best practices things. Encrypting and versioning, it's pretty hard to shoot yourself in the foot with. You just more or less just flip them on, and that's good enough for most people. For encrypting, you do have the option to utilize your own key and enforce encryption enforce that the file is encrypted prior to uploading it using a key that you own. But you can also specify either a global KMS key or a particular key that you specify. The CMK, I'm sorry, the customer master key or a KMS key that you specify. And then versioning is just for the off chance you happen to, someone gets in there and either maliciously or accidentally nukes a file and you need that back, or overwrites with changes that shouldn't have happened. It gives you the option to revert. As with pretty much all security recommendations within a cloud environment, they go pretty much hand in hand with not only just securing, but from a business continuity perspective, from a DR and defer standpoint, all those kind of things, they tie in very closely with this kind of model and architecture.
Great, thanks for that, John. Jerry, is there anything you would like to, kind of add here off the cuff?
No. I mean, that was a great overview of S3 security. John is definitely the expert on that.
Awesome. So, I recommend watching these talks. There are a couple talks I found fairly interesting at reInvent this year. The first is best practices to secure data lake on AWS. It talks a lot more about access control and encryption of files, essentially exercise principle of least privileged. And then also they released a talk on SFTP, which you can go and check out and provide, a little more detail than we're able to provide you today. So we're going to move on and talk about serverless. Between serverless and machine learning, you couldn't walk 10 feet down the hallways of reInvent without hearing at least one of these terms. I'm pretty sure I still hear them ringing in my ears back home now, almost a week later. So serverless is
the top term at the conference. They did a whole aggregation of that, and serverless was #1.
Really? Was machine learning #2?
No, actually, it was like #4. So it was actually surprisingly lower down.
That's impressive. That's impressive.
Yep. This was the first AWS that I've gone to where the conversation switched from do we stay on premise and move to the cloud to do we stay in VPSs and EC2 instances, or do we go serverless? Like, there's been a shift in the last 12 months where everybody knows they're going to the cloud, but it's, do we build servers in the cloud now, or do we use cloud native tools?
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, it's really, AWS themselves is pushing really hard to get their customers onto serverless. It's generally cheaper for the customer. And if it's cheaper for the customers, they're going to be paying AWS more money in the long run. So, it works out for everyone. AWS released a few new services and features this year to kind of help improve, security and functionality in the serverless architecture. They released a feature called Lambda Layers, and we'll talk about that a little bit. My favorite is the Lambda custom runtimes, which were announced at the keynote. They released a micro VM open source called Firecracker, and they announced the support of Lambda coupled with application load balancers. So we'll talk about each of these a little bit. So Lambda Layers. one of the biggest problems with going serverless is the integration of things like libraries and microservices. Originally it was pretty hard to manage this type of stuff, and that's what Lambda layers is designed to kind of handle. So conceptually, a layer is essentially a library or a function that can be invoked or associated from another Lambda function. And there are some restrictions on this, and I'm a little surprised by these. Essentially you can only have 5 layers per function, which struck me as a little low, and I'm kind of wondering why they've benchmarked it that way. In the layers, once the entire package has been unzipped, can be no larger than 250 megabytes. That's fairly limiting. I know folks are moving away from large libraries, so it's probably not a major issue. But if you're looking to move to the cloud and continue supporting some legacy systems, this may be a choking point for you. And there are ways of architecting around that, obviously. It's just not as user-friendly. As a security consultant, one of the things I'm going to be looking out for is public layers. So they support public layers, or essentially public libraries that you can invoke directly in your code. And with any third-party code, there's a substantial chance of introducing a vulnerability, as we all, kind of understand now. Jonn, how excited are you about Lambda layers? I know this has been one of your pain points for a while.
Oh, yeah, I'm ecstatic about this. I mean, I've never managed a massive serverless architecture before. Everything I've done has been pretty much at the toy and sandbox level. But even at that level, it can be a total pain to manage that kind of stuff without bringing in something like the serverless framework, or like having a tightly coupled CI/CD pipe. Well, not tightly coupled, but having a well-managed and well-built CI/CD pipeline. It's not really friendly towards just standing up a handful of functions and then managing them simply. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I know, like, as a big Python fan and as someone who tinkers in Lambda pretty frequently, being able just to have a request layer that I can just upload once and be done with it will be fantastic. So I never have to create a virtual environment, install requirements to my local directory, create a deployment package, and upload every time I want to create a new function. It's just a total pain. So just having this layer is, I'm done. I create it once and I'm done. I just include that in every function I want to use requests with. So that's going to be very nice. The public layers, like you said, I'm very interested in that from the security perspective. I can't wait to start scraping that and seeing what kind of goodness falls out of it. I'm sure we'll find some interesting things.
Yeah, me too. And I know, Jerry's a pretty solid vulnerability researcher. I love reading his posts about things. And Jerry, I can imagine you're going to find some pretty interesting, public Lambda layers, in your free time. Is that something you've thought about looking into?
Yeah, I'm guessing that they've locked down S3, and now everybody will just move to searching for Lambda layers. It'll just be the next hot thing in AWS for vulnerability researchers.
Yeah,
for sure. But bug bounties, here we come. But yeah, I'm super excited about Lambda layers for sure. It's time to start building serverless. Yeah, and so just a quick sneak peek at the UI. This is already generally available, but if you go into a Lambda function, you'll see an option called layers, and from there you can add a layer. And the UI will kind of guide you through that particular process. Once you've added a layer, you can reference it as you would in any library. So if you're a Python developer, you would just call import requests as an example, and that's how it would be pulled in. So my personal favorite, Lambda custom runtimes. So Lambda had been, pretty limited to certain languages, Python, Node, Go, .NET, etc. And so in the keynote, they announced custom runtimes for Lambda. And they also, and this is my favorite announcement from reInvent, they also released Ruby as native runtime support. So this is, I know John Callahan's going to be super excited that he gets to work with me and write a bunch of Ruby serverless functions. It's going to be great.
Excited. It's my favorite language.
And I'm sure Jerry's team is going to be, excited about that too. So
we will be.
Yeah. The custom runtimes is an interesting concept, and the way those work is they've released a custom runtime toolkit where you can build custom runtime engines for your favorite languages. And to kind of demonstrate how this works, they released implementations for both C++ and Rust. So you can go ahead, you can look at those today, and you can start building serverless apps with C++ and Rust on Lambda. It's pretty incredible. And I think we're going to start to see a lot of financial organizations and folks that have some legacy C++ code starting to move to Lambda and serverless in the near future. I personally haven't played with the custom runtimes at all. John, have you played with them yet?
No, but I want to get in there so I can have the world's first serverless buffer overflow attack. And I can't wait for that. The return of C++ level errors and cloud-hosted Lambda functions that'll be a throwback, and it'll be interesting to see how those actually start cropping up in the wild.
Well, there's gonna be the language-specific bones, like you mentioned, buffer overflows and C++, but then there's gonna be the bugs in the runtime environments, and those are what I'm really curious about. If Jack, our CEO, came to me and said, "Hey, John, build the Scala runtime, for Lambda," I'm gonna look around, I'm gonna see what's already there, and I'm gonna start building it myself. And I can only imagine there's gonna be a significant amount of complexity to introduce vulnerabilities in that particular layer. So that'd be very interesting to me. So adding adding a custom runtime is very easy. When you go to author your Lambda function, you'll see this runtime drop down. That's where you traditionally would have selected Node or Python. And now you can select Ruby, and you can select use custom runtime function, and then you'll specify a Lambda layer for that. So I'm curious to see how it works. I haven't played around with that yet myself. So Amazon also announced Firecracker, which is a lightweight micro VM. And Firecracker is pretty interesting because it actually powers both Lambda and Fargate under the hood. So you know what it's capable of because most of us have been using it for a while. It's an open source project. You can go ahead and take a look. And by default, the Firecracker binary is installed by default on the AWS .metal instances. You can also compile and use it on your own on-premise bare metal servers. And I was watching a talk where one of the architects had said that Firecracker is so fast, you could reliably use it to respond to HTTP requests, which is quite interesting because that's from the ground up, build this VM, run it, have it execute this code, and respond to this, HTTP request. It's insanely fast spin up time. And they've really, have you played with it?
No, but now JP knows this, but for the rest of you guys, I have a Lambda pre-warming blog post that's like 95% written, and I was about to release it, and I heard about Firecracker. It's like, well, I guess I should just nuke that blog post. I'm guessing pre-warming will no longer be a thing since Lambda is going to be powered by Firecracker. With the spin-up times that they're claiming, it's going to be pretty ridiculous to see the kind of things they're doing. I still need to test like a worst-case scenario, like a Java Lambda running inside of VPC, since the ENI allocation within a VPC is the thing that really kills the Lambda cold start period.
So worth mentioning there, John, is they are refactoring the networking side of Lambda in 2019.
Yep.
It'll no longer be, ENI driven the way it is now. So yeah, I'm excited about this. There's a talk I recommend watching where they talk about the security internals of it. And being a Lambda customer, a Lambda consumer, I feel a lot better knowing how it's operating under the hood because it's an architecture I can get behind and fully support. So definitely check out that talk. Amazon Lambda Application Load Balancer. John, do you want to talk about this one a little bit?
Yeah, this is actually really interesting. Traditionally for years now, the way you use Lambda is hooked up to API gateway, obviously. So they just at reInvent, they announced the ability for you to add Lambdas as a target for an application load balancer. So you can actually now handle HTTP requests and HTTPS, obviously, requests via Lambda. So now you can not write not only your APIs, but your traditional web form type applications via Lambda now too. And while most people probably aren't going to be implementing an application from scratch to do this, the real power in it is in migration. If you have some legacy application that you want to slowly start migrating away from traditional web forms over to an API, you can do that in chunks, and you can serve it off the same ALB without having to have two separate architectures to maintain. The other neat thing that comes with it is you can actually still gain the benefits of health checks from your Lambda as well, or from a Lambda target as well. It'll actually execute the Lambda for you. And if you have your ALB set to failover mode, you can have it fall back to to something else if your Lambda, for whatever reason, isn't working, which I think is pretty neat. It's a cool little feature to have that I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate from the enterprise layer or enterprise level. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, that's great, John. I was actually sitting here yesterday thinking to myself, geez, why is this so important to Callahan? And hearing you explain it really makes a lot of sense to me. So
yeah,
I'm glad. Yeah.
At first blush, it doesn't seem like anything special. I had to sit there and think about it for a little while and realize there's a couple of niche cases where it could be fairly powerful. Definitely niche. Not going to be something most people even touch, but I thought it was cool nonetheless.
Got you. And Jerry, do you have anything you want to add there?
I think that was covered way better than I can. I think he did a good job. Like, he's really deep. He's deeper in this than I am.
I like Lambda.
Fair enough. So speaking of liking Lambda, there are best practices associated with going serverless, and I'll let Callahan explain these to you guys.
So the security concerns for Lambda are actually pretty interesting because they're a lot different than a lot of other concerns you would have in a traditional architecture. The really interesting one that I find particularly is timeouts. So when you create your Lambda function, you have to set a timeout period for how long it can execute before it gets killed by AWS. So if you have a complex architecture where you have Lambdas invoking Lambdas, you can end up getting these cascading failures where you're 3 or 4 Lambdas deep, it times out, and then it cascades backwards and times out everything behind it. And then you end up with these fairly large failures that are knocking out good parts of your API or your architecture. And I'm not going to get too deep into how to fix this. On the next slide, there will be my recommended talk. It's on applying the principles of chaos engineering to serverless architectures. Really good talk, and he covers this in depth and how to deal with it. The short answer is that Lambda functions have access to a context object, and that context object will actually have a value in it that gives you the amount of time remaining in your Lambda execution period. So when calling another service, an external service, set a manual timeout and derive that from how much execution time you have left. So you can, if the other service times out, you save yourself 500 milliseconds or a second or whatever you need to recover from that timeout and gracefully fail without causing cascading failures. It's a really good talk, though. It goes into much more depth on that front.
So I need to quickly apologize to you, John. I did forget to include that link in these slides. But I will add that talk to the slides before we email them out. Okay.
And if someone just wants to note it down now, the course number is DVC 305. That's Delta Victor Charlie 305. Applying the principles of chaos engineering to serverless. Yeah, so some other stuff to look into is reserved concurrency. Cannot talk today. And this basically sets the maximum number of concurrent executions you can have for a particular Lambda script. And this is just kind of done from a sandboxing sanity control kind of thing. It's really not a good idea to have recursive API or recursive Lambda calls, but I did it anyway and wrote a fork bomb in Lambda just for fun. And the way you protect against that kind of stuff is having reserved concurrency. So across your entire account, you can have like 1,000 simultaneous executions across all your Lambda functions. It's the unreserved concurrency. But what you can do is you can set a reserved concurrency on a per Lambda level to some number less than whatever your total account is. That way, it'll always be guaranteed to have be able to execute at least 100 times concurrently. So that can give you some saving grace. Deriving those numbers is hard, you really have to have a good understanding of your architecture and how code paths work and typical execution times and things like that. You really got to rely on something like X-Ray or Dynatrace or any of the number of other services out there that'll do that or provide that information for you. Like I said, avoid recursion. Like don't. It's super dangerous. Just don't do it unless you have a very, very good reason to. The same thing with not even recursively, but just invoking any other Lambda function can get you into some hot water. If user provided data is able to control that, you might be able to do some damage with that. It's your typical injection attack. It's a very sensitive function. You want to be careful what you're passing into it. And then pre-warming. I mean, we touched on this a little bit in the past. Pre-warming very well may be dead, especially with the ENI changes coming in 2019. But if you're even right now, it's not that big of a deal. I tested it a week ago, and a cold start from my test Lambda function took 40 milliseconds, and a warm start took 8. I mean, the difference between 40 milliseconds and 8 milliseconds is pretty minuscule, and unless you're writing some like very sensitive, some very high throughput application within Lambda, it's really outside of your. It shouldn't be something you worry about. Premature optimization should be avoided. That's where you end up shooting yourself in the foot as a developer when you can be focusing on bigger things.
So one thing I recommend, John, is taking a look at this particular talk where they dive deeply under the hood in AWS Lambda. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the talks where they teach you so much about what's going on internally that you leave. And as the speaker says, it was for your entertainment. There's not a lot of implementation details behind that, but a lot of the points you brought up are greatly summarized in that particular talk. One last thing worth mentioning is that AWS announced that they're spinning off a security-specific conference, which I'm very excited about. It's called Reinforce. It'll be held in Boston June 25th and 26th. I would sign up early. There's a good chance this will sell out. So if you're looking to connect to ourselves, Jerry, I don't know if you plan on being there. I certainly do plan on being there. But, hit us up and you'll be able to find most of us at Reinforce, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's on my list. The timing's a little suspect, right? 3 weeks before Black Hat, but I'm going to try to get out there. Yeah,
definitely, man. So, we're pretty much at the hour duration here. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take some questions now. Again, the slides in the recorded talk will be made available after the fact. And if you're looking to get in contact with us, here's our contact information. Once again, I'd really like to thank Jerry Gamblin for joining us today. And thanks to John Callahan for hopping on as well. And if you have any questions for any of us, don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you guys very, very much for having me. It's been a really fun time.
Yeah, no problem. All right, well, I don't see any questions coming in.